Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are doing a deep dive into one of the most transformative and, frankly, terrifying periods in modern American history, the Red Scare.
And our guide for this is Clay Risen's exceptional book, Red Scare: Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America.
It's a fantastic source.
When you hear Red Scare, you probably, you conjure up images of Senator Joseph McCarthy waving a piece of paper.
Right, or maybe the Hollywood 10.
Exactly. But Risen's work and our whole mission today is to drill down far beyond those individuals. We're looking at the systemic transformation, the way it fundamentally reshaped how the United States functions as a democracy.
Absolutely. The conventional story, the one we all sort of learn, treats the Red Scare as a temporary fit of madness.
A witch hunt.
A witch hunt, yeah. A brief, unfortunate episode led by a few extremists. But Risen forces us to see it so differently. This wasn't a brief political moment. It was a decade-long society-wide shift.
A crisis that basically leveraged fear to institutionalize all these new practices.
Yes. Loyalty testing, constant surveillance, ideological exclusion. And the key thing is, these practices didn't just vanish when McCarthy fell from grace. They became deeply, deeply embedded in our institutions, both governmental and private.
So we're not just looking at history here. We're looking at the mechanics of democratic erosion. How does repression go from being this, fringe extremist idea to becoming a standard legal and even socially mandatory way of operating?
That is precisely the angle of this deep dive. We want to understand the systems-level mechanics. How did this repression take root? How did it persist and even expand long after the genuine threat and even the loudest demagogues had kind of faded away?
It's a way to understand the structural recurrence of these things.
Exactly. How they gain a life of their own through bureaucracy and just institutional compliance, which makes them so much harder to stop the next time around.
Okay, so let's start by situating Risen and his approach. He's a historian who really focuses on American democracy under intense stress. He's written about the Civil Rights Act, the King assassination.
Right, these pivotal high-pressure moments.
So what's the core argument in Red Scare that forces us to move past that conventional McCarthy-centric narrative?
I think his core contention is that McCarthy was just a symptom, a very crude, very loud manifestation of a process that was already in motion.
So the system was already built before he showed up.
It was already fully operational and running at speed long before McCarthy, who was a pretty minor senator at the time, even stepped onto the national stage in 1950. Rosen shows the Red Scare was this slow burn process. It was rooted in ideological conflicts from the 1930s that were just waiting for the right crisis to give them a spark.
And to get that, we have to understand the sheer instability of that moment right after World War II. Risen calls it the post-WWII crucible.
It was a world turned upside down, incredibly volatile. I mean, think about the geopolitical shift. It was sudden. It was terrifying.
The Soviet Union goes from our ally.
From Uncle Joe, right. The American government was literally promoting films like Song of Russia that celebrated the Soviets. And then overnight, they become the primary global enemy, and suddenly they have nuclear weapons. That prospect of nuclear war was an immediate existential threat that most Americans had never even conceived of.
And that's just the external pressure. Domestically, things were just as fractured.
Massively. The war ends, millions of soldiers come home, and the social fabric is just straining under the pressure. You had widespread post-war anxiety.
Scarcity.
Scarcity was huge, housing shortages, intense competition for jobs, and crucially, there was major labor and racial unrest. The source material points out that almost 5 million workers walked off their jobs in the year right after the war.
Wow.
Yeah. So when a society is facing that much internal instability, that much dislocation, the public is really primed to look for simple conspiratorial explanations, to look for internal enemies to blame.
So the core thesis we're tracking here is how this external and internal volatility just combine to permanently transform the country.
And that transformation normalized surveillance, it normalized loyalty testing, and this idea of ideological exclusion across pretty much all institutions.
It formalized suspicion.
It formalized suspicion as a mechanism of social control. It really did. And the whole mechanism of the Red Scare becomes much clearer when you realize it was fueled by two powerful, long-simmering impulses that finally merged.
The Cold War crisis abroad.
Merged with a deep, existing culture war crisis at home.
Yep.
The Cold War provided the mechanism, and the culture war provided the resentment.
Let's unpack those dual impulses then. Let's start with the culture war. The New Deal progressivism versus this powerful conservative backlash. We have to go back to the Great Depression to see where this all started.
The Great Depression was, in a sense, the dark birth of this progressive vision. The economic collapse catalyzed a massive political awakening. And the left, and I mean everyone from mainstream liberals, unionists, socialists, all the way to hardcore communists, they coalesced around the New Deal.
They all believed the government had this central activist role to play in society.
And the Communist Party was surprisingly effective at exploiting that moment. They had this strategy called the Popular Front.
Right. This was a global strategy.
A direct order from Stalin in 1935. Communist parties everywhere were told to de-emphasize revolution and instead build these broad coalitions with mainstream leftist groups. The goal was to fight fascism internationally and, secure social change at home.
And in the U.S., the party leader, Earl Browder, he had that famous line.
Communism is 20th century Americanism.
Yeah.
They were positioning themselves not as these foreign revolutionaries, but as the true heirs to the American Revolution, fighting for labor rights, for racial equality, supporting causes like aid to the Spanish Republicans against Franco.
And this progressive fervor, it wasn't just some abstract idea. It created massive, visible social change.
Oh, it ushered in an America that was rapidly becoming more egalitarian, more diverse, and certainly more tolerant than it had been before the Depression. You saw doors opening for women in the workforce, African Americans beginning to challenge Jim Crow through New Deal agencies.
And Risen even points out the early visibility for gay men and lesbians in Washington's expanding, more cosmopolitan federal environment.
Exactly. The traditional American social order, which was built on this idea of white Protestant male privilege, was visibly starting to break down.
And that kind of profound cultural shift, well, it bred an equally powerful conservative reaction that saw all these changes as a genuine existential threat.
Their opposition, it went so far beyond just hating high taxes or federal regulations. It was intensely, almost spiritually cultural. They feared this anti-capitalist rhetoric they saw bleeding out from universities, from labor halls, even from Hollywood.
They looked at the new social norms, working women, assertive unions, civil rights activism, and saw it as something foreign.
Sinister, something foreign, that was the language. It was a profound fear that the American bloodstream itself was being polluted by these foreign ideas.
And this is where that concept of the paranoid style that Richard Hofstadter wrote about really takes hold, isn't it? The conservative backlash needed a simple, evil explanation for all these rapid changes they resented.
Precisely. And that anger targeted the symbols of the New Deal. Roosevelt's East Coast liberal elite, the Groton-Yale crowd, and that whole bureaucratic alphabet soup of new federal agencies.
The logic was this can't be organic. It has to be a conspiracy.
It has to be. So right-wing figures started widely smearing the New Deal as a tool of Soviet subversion.
Which is, it's the clear precedent for the deep state narrative we hear today.
It is. The claim that this vast, anonymous cadre of bureaucrats is secretly answering to a foreign ideology, subverting American values from within the government's own structure.
It's the same narrative structure.
Identical. Just swap New Dealer for communist. You had Republican congressmen claiming Roosevelt's National Recovery Act Russianizes the business of America. This wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was existential fear, fueled by cultural nostalgia, just waiting for a chance to purge the government of all its progressive personnel.
Okay, so those deep ideological roots were the fuel. Now let's bring in the immediate Cold War catalyst, the crisis that gave them the mechanism to weaponize that cultural resentment, the demand for absolute loyalty.
And the really critical thing to acknowledge here is that while most of the paranoia was unfounded, there was a legitimate reality to some of the concerns.
You mean there really was Soviet espionage?
Yes. Truman initially kind of scoffed at it, but a small, dedicated fraction of Americans were spying for the Soviets. The source material confirms people like Harold Ware, Victor Perlow, Nathan Silvermaster. They ran espionage rings and recruited people like Alger Hiss.
And the later Venona decrypts proved a lot of this.
Compellingly. They proved that people like Hiss, the Rosenbergs, and the CPUSA leadership had in fact worked against the U.S. So that reality provided the initial crucial justification for the security apparatus to expand.
But here's the irony, right? The one that Risen points out.
It's a profound irony. By the time the Red Scare reached its peak intensity in the early 1950s, the era of widespread Soviet espionage had largely faded. The networks were mostly gone. The American Communist Party was collapsing internally.
But the fear had become independent of the fact.
Exactly. The fear became this all-consuming, all-powerful force that demanded total security, even if it meant sacrificing due process and throwing innocent people under the bus along the way.
And this required the security apparatus to pivot. They had to start looking for potential threats, not just actual proven spies.
Exactly. The logic of total security inherited from World War II played a huge part. The security state didn't just demobilize, it went looking for the next threat. And J. Edgar Hoover was ready.
He had been obsessed with communism since the 1919 Palmer raids.
Since 1919, his FBI amassed this enormous surveillance network. And they got key intelligence from defectors like Igor Gouzenko and Elizabeth Bentley, who famously named 83 people, including Hiss, from her time as a career.
But the real shift, the thing that created the structural Red Scare, came from a tactical political decision inside the Truman administration. They had to sell a Cold War to the American public.
And they needed to scare them badly to do it.
Right.
That decision came in 1947 from the realization that the U.S. had to take the lead in containing Soviet expansion. It started with aid to Greece and Turkey, which would become the Truman Doctrine. Secretary of State Dean Acheson explicitly used language that was a clear precursor to the domino theory.
And they needed Congress to authorize, $400 million?
$400 million, and they needed it immediately. So the government knew that to get Congress on board, they had to manufacture a sense of existential urgency at home.
And this is where we get that infamous piece of advice from Senator Arthur Vandenberg,
a key Republican. He told President Truman that to get the aid package approved, he needed to scare the hell out of the country.
And the result of scaring the country wasn't just foreign aid. It was the institutionalization of domestic suspicion. The 1947 Loyalty Program.
That program was the initial gear that connected the culture war to the Cold War. It required screening every single federal employee for membership in, affiliation with, or sympathetic association with subversive groups.
And that language is so key. Sympathetic association.
It's not about espionage. It's not about intent. It's about mere association, mere sympathy.
Which is completely wide open to interpretation.
Yeah.
And the anti-New Deal forces saw this immediately as their chance.
Oh, it was their chance to escalate the cultural conflict. It was weaponized against anyone who had championed progressive causes in the 30s.
Right.
Maybe you donated a few dollars to a Spanish Civil War refugee group, or you attended a single left-leaning meeting 5 years earlier.
That history of association, no matter how minor or innocent,
was instantly leveraged into a career-ending taint. The government itself provided the system. The loyalty oaths, the screening procedures, and the cultural backlash was only too happy to exploit it.
So once that mechanism was in place, it really paved the way for the formal government machinery to embed this kind of ideological policing into governance itself. And that starts with HUAC.
The House Un-American Activities Committee. HUAC was the vanguard of institutionalized suspicion. It didn't start the Red Scare, but it gave it a public stage, a theater.
And it had almost been dissolved after the war.
It had. It was saved by these powerful, conservative Southern Democrats, particularly John Rankin of Mississippi.
And Rankin's motive was pretty explicit. He wanted to use HUAC to expose what he saw as this vast liberal communist conspiracy linking New Deal progressives, labor unions, and the whole Roosevelt administration.
Exactly. So the HUAC hearings, they weren't really about uncovering spies or gathering intelligence. They were about performing a public degradation ceremony.
A ritual.
A ritual designed to enforce ideological conformity through public shaming, through ostracism, and through the complete destruction of people's professional lives.
And we see this ritualistic approach start shockingly early. Let's talk about the case risen details. Helen Reed Bryan in January of 1946.
Bryan was the executive secretary of the Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee. It was a progressive charity. HUAC subpoenaed records that, ironically, were already filed with the federal government.
So it was a pretext.
It seems like it. When Bryan appeared before the committee, she was immediately blocked from reading her prepared statement, which would have put the committee's actions into a really critical political context.
The interaction in the book is just painful to read. It shows the complete powerlessness of the accused. Rankin just insisted on a yes or no answer.
Are you going to hand over the records or not? And she refused. She stood on principle and was immediately held in contempt of Congress. She was one of the first in a long, long line of victims who faced prison time just for refusing to participate in what they saw as a politically motivated fishing expedition.
And this brutal, dehumanizing ritual, refuse to name names and you go to jail, but comply, and your career is ruined and you're a social pariah. That became the numbingly common standard for years.
The systemic insight there is that for the accused, the process was the punishment. Just being suspected, getting that kind of smoke taint from an association made years ago, that was enough to destroy life, regardless of any actual crime.
It's a total shift from a justice system focused on proof to a security system focused on possibility.
Right. And meanwhile, the Justice Department, they needed actual legal tools to go after the CPUSA directly. They needed more than just the uncorroborated testimony of defectors like Elizabeth Bentley, even though it was often true.
They needed a legal workaround, and that's where the Smith Act, this obscure 1940 law, comes into the picture.
Yeah, prosecutors knew that proving actual espionage or treason was incredibly difficult, especially because they refused to reveal the highly sensitive Venona intercepts that actually proved his guilt.
They had proof, but they couldn't use it publicly.
They couldn't. So they dusted off the Smith Act. It was originally focused on barring revolutionary aliens from entering the country.
What was the specific language in it that made it such a powerful weapon?
The provision outlawed advocating or teaching, the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing or destroying any government by force or violence.
So it's targeting belief and membership, not action.
Exactly, not actual violent action or plotting. And by 1949, this act was being used to effectively outlaw the Communist Party of the United States. It sent dozens of its top leaders to prison.
So the government is using a legal mechanism to prosecute political dissent. They're not prosecuting people for spying, but for being communists. That is the very definition of legalizing repression.
It formalized the idea that just having certain political beliefs was synonymous with treason. The Smith Act trials established that even if you never lifted a finger to commit violence, if you advocated the theory of violent overthrow or were just a leader in a group that did, you were guilty. It was the ultimate tool for achieving ideological conformity within the political system.
Okay, so the stage is now set for the final piece of this government machinery, the Hiss Chambers affair. This is what provided the ideological polarization that turned a political system into a moral battlefield.
The Hiss Chambers case was just foundational because it crystallized the entire cultural conflict. Alger Hiss, he was the absolute epitome of the liberal establishment. Groton, Yale, Harvard Law, Supreme Court clerk, a rising star in the State Department.
And Whittaker Chambers, his accuser, was the opposite, an apostate communist courier, rougher, more working class.
So if Hiss, this symbol of the East Coast elite, was guilty of espionage, it fundamentally proved the Red Baiters correct. It proved that the liberal establishment had betrayed the country.
It turned a complex political mystery into this stark, black and white moral conflict for the public. All nuance was just lost.
Completely lost. Millions of Americans who resented the New Deal looked at Hiss and saw confirmation that all the disorienting changes of the last 2 decades weren't just bad policy, they were the result of a vast, nefarious plot.
And this created two reciprocal camps that you could argue dominate our politics even today.
You could. The first was McCarthyism, the use of baseless smearing and reckless charges of communist sympathies to attack political opponents.
And the second was Hissism.
Hissism, the insistence on Hiss's innocence by the liberal establishment, even as the evidence mounted against him. They just couldn't bear the thought that one of their own might have betrayed them because that would validate the conspiracy theories of their opponents.
It created a political ecosystem where admitting you were wrong on the facts meant losing the entire ideological war.
Right.
The stakes were just too high for truth.
Precisely. This polarized environment convinced millions that the only way forward was through absolute ideological purity and the wholesale purging of the internal enemy. The government mechanisms were in place. The ideological fuel was stoked.
And now here's the really terrifying systemic leap.
Yeah.
The moment that fear migrated out of Washington and just went viral, it spread into every corner of American society. This is where ideological conformity becomes the literal price of participating in American life.
Let's start with Hollywood and the private corporate compliance machine.
Hollywood was such a natural and powerful target because it represented that cultural shift that conservatives hated.
They saw it as a den of liberal iniquity. And while some prominent figures, like Ronald Reagan, who was then head of the Screen Actors Guild, initially warned against outright witch hunts, the studios themselves ultimately institutionalized the threat.
How did these pressure groups manage to force the most powerful studio executives in the world to comply so quickly?
Well, groups like the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals built strong, explicit ties with HUAC. And the industry executives, Jack Warner, Louis B. Mayer, they capitulated almost immediately.
They were afraid of boycotts.
Boycotts, bad publicity, being branded as soft on communism. They literally called for legislation to bar communists from working in the private sector. They essentially volunteered their own industry for policing.
Yeah, that Warner quote is incredible. Offering to subscribe generously to a pest removal fund to ship communists to Russia. It shows the extent of the fear and the capitulation.
It illustrates the perverse incentive system, doesn't it? The easiest, lowest risk action was always just to comply and purge. And the human cost was immediate. It targeted some of the industry's most talented people, like the screenwriter Dalton Trumbo.
At the time, Trumbo was the highest paid writer in Hollywood, a celebrated talent. He gets blacklisted, but the system doesn't stop him from working entirely.
No, it just forced him underground. He was a survivor. He kept writing under various pseudonyms, even won an Oscar for The Brave One under the name Robert Rich. But his public life was ruined.
And it wasn't just professional. He endured horrific personal vigilante threats.
Dead animals and bags of feces left in his swimming pool. It just shows how the government hearings created this vacuum that was then filled by public shaming and threats of actual physical violence against anyone who refused to ideologically surrender.
And that fear also created an entire industry dedicated to profiting from suspicion, the private list economy.
This is one of the clearest examples of the system becoming self-sustaining and monetized. Enterprising activists realized they could sell paranoia. They published these bulging lists of suspected individuals, often based on pure hearsay, supposition, or minor past associations.
And publications like Red Channels and Counterattack became mandatory reading. The Bible up and down Madison Avenue.
The fact that Madison Avenue, the advertising heart of America, institutionalized the blacklist is so crucial. It proves that government action didn't have to be direct to be devastating. The money men, the corporate sponsors, they were just terrified of risk.
The story of Jean Muir is the perfect example.
She was fired from the soap opera, The Aldrich Family, simply because her name appeared in Red Channels. And advertisers told the producers, flatly, "We cannot take any chances. We quarantine everyone in the book." The private sector, driven by financial risk avoidance, became the most powerful enforcer of ideological conformity.
And that same systemic pressure was aimed at the labor movement, which had been this powerful vanguard for progressive social change during the New Deal.
Yeah, the government only tolerated unionized labor if it was politically compliant. And the legal mechanism they used here was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947.
Passed over Truman's veto.
It was. And this act required union leaders to sign anti-communist affidavits. It essentially forced the unions to police themselves or forfeit all federal protections.
Which put the mainstream unions, like the CIO, in this impossible position regarding their more militant left-wing members.
It led to a massive self-inflicted wound. To survive politically, the CIO ultimately purged its most left-wing and progressive unions. And this wasn't just paranoia, it was a desperate political calculation to secure their own legitimacy. A central figure in this conflict was Harry Bridges,
The Australian-born leader of the Longshoremen.
immensely charismatic, very cooperative with the communist-led labor movement, which made him an immediate government target.
The Justice Department was obsessed with him.
Obsessed. They tried to deport him 4 different times over 2 decades, trying to prove he was a communist or had lied about it. The FBI file on him was 4,000 pages by 1940. He just embodied this militant, globally aware, racially progressive union leadership that the establishment found so threatening.
So when the CIO purges its left-wing members, what was the lasting consequence, beyond just losing a few leaders?
The purge eliminated the movement's most visionary and militant wing. These were the leaders who were championing a truly egalitarian social order. They weren't just pushing for higher wages and better hours, they were pushing for racial and sexual equality, for deep societal reform. By destroying that critical left wing, the Red Scare basically eliminated a powerful, organized, and effective vanguard for progressive social change in America that wouldn't be recovered for decades.
And beyond labor and media, the system spreads into education and the culture itself, an anti-intellectual and social purge that permeated school boards and dinner tables.
Education became this fiercely contested ideological terrain. Conservative critics, using major platforms like the Chicago Tribune, they attacked the very idea of publicly supported education as inherently socialistic.
Right, arguing it was just propaganda for New Deal doctrines.
Exactly. So teachers and professors became prime targets for investigation, for loyalty oaths, for public scrutiny. And once again, the institutional pressure worked quickly. The American Association of Universities, we're talking Harvard, Yale, declared that no communists should be allowed to teach, and administrators across the country just rapidly comply.
Which led to the mass firing of highly capable educators, people known for being excellent in the classroom.
Purged purely for past political associations or progressive views they held outside of school, regardless of their professional conduct. We see examples like Julius Lovety, a highly respected math teacher, fired because of past political affiliations. Even school library books were scrutinized, censored, purged from shelves. The system demanded total intellectual uniformity.
And maybe the most insidious structural manifestation of this desire for total internal purity was the Lavender Scare.
Yeah, where the fear of homosexuality became deliberately intertwined with the fear of communism.
This linkage was deliberate, it was powerful, and it was ruinous for thousands of people.
It was. Homosexuality was deemed a national security threat, not just because the culture was deeply homophobic, but because government officials argued that homosexuals were inherently subject to blackmail. The logic was that their secrets made them vulnerable to Soviet agents, and therefore, they were all security risks.
This just massively expands the definition of who an internal enemy is. It goes beyond political dissenters to anyone whose personal life deviates from this narrow definition of acceptable American behavior.
Exactly. The fear wasn't just about protecting state secrets anymore. It was about protecting a perceived moral purity, which conservatives linked directly to American exceptionalism. We even have the Republican National Committee chairman at the time, Guy George Gabrielson, publicly claiming that sexual perverts who have infiltrated our government were perhaps as dangerous as the actual communists.
And that rhetoric was used to justify firing and blacklisting thousands of non-communists from federal jobs.
The sheer number of people affected by the Lavender Scare, estimated to be thousands fired from government jobs, it just shows its systemic bureaucratic nature. This wasn't individual prejudice. This was institutionalized discrimination disguised as security policy.
Is bureaucratic cleansing.
It was. And culturally, this era cemented a very narrow, highly controlled view of Americanism. Sometimes it's called domestic containment. It pushed women out of the workforce, it disparaged independent women, and it demanded a return to this conservative, nuclear family ideal, completely rejecting the diversity and social experimentation that had been celebrated in the 1930s.
Okay, so we've established the deep cultural roots, the Cold War spark, and the institutional mechanisms. Now, let's finally bring in the figure everyone remembers, Joseph McCarthy. Risen's whole point is that McCarthy was the symptom and the amplifier, the voice that crudely articulated a system that was already fully built.
McCarthy did not invent this system. He basically stumbled into it because he needed political relevance. He was a pretty obscure senator. His political fortunes were sagging. And then he gives that infamous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia in February 1950.
And he claims to have a list of 205 security risks in the State Department.
A list that, as the book details, was based on outdated, misinterpreted data from 1946. I mean, it was a hair's breadth away from being an outright lie. Certainly wasn't the bombshell he claimed it was.
But the facts didn't matter.
The facts didn't matter at all. The actual number, the names, the consistency of the threat, it was all irrelevant to the performance. McCarthy's true significance was his ability to loudly and crudely combine the two core impulses of the Red Scare. That deep, long-standing anti-New Deal reactionism and the immediate, frantic Cold War national security fear.
He gave the conservative hard right, who had spent 20 years raging against Roosevelt's deep state, a powerful mainstream voice. He welded their cultural hatred of progressivism to the nation's new terror of Soviet communism.
And crucially, he had immediate and deep institutional support, despite his gross methods. After that devastating 1948 election loss, his Republican colleagues just embraced ardent anti-communism as a winning political strategy. And even more chillingly, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, which was chaired by Democrat Pat McCarran, gave McCarthy's often wild attacks an official, somewhat sanitized gloss.
Which essentially made McCarthyism a bipartisan phenomenon in Congress.
It did. And this leads us to one of the book's most crucial systemic points, how this repression became completely self-sustaining, how it proliferated lists and loyalty tests even as the real security threat diminished.
The bureaucracy of fear just took on a life of its own.
Independent of reality, the FBI maintained millions of index cards for custodial detention, essentially pre-planning mass arrests for security risks in case of war. This infrastructure was permanent, And meanwhile, private groups and local governments just rapidly multiplied the Department of Justice's list of subversive organizations.
The examples Risen gives of this list proliferation are just astonishing. They border on the absurd.
They really show the fever pitch of compliance. The DOJ's list of subversive organizations became this universal vetting tool. In Indiana, they required professional wrestlers to sign loyalty oaths.
Right. And in New York State, you needed to clear the list just to get a permit to fish in a public reservoir.
But to fish in a reservoir, loyalty was no longer about national security. It was about confirming your worthiness to participate in basic civil life.
So the more that politicians and companies and local groups complied with the fear, the more loyalty oaths they required, the more names they purged, the more normalized and necessary this whole system of vigilance seemed to everyone else.
It's a powerful, positive feedback loop, the compliance feedback loop in action. Even though the CPUSA was imploding and Soviet espionage was largely receding, the list proliferation created a permanent, self-perpetuating infrastructure of suspicion that just kept going, regardless of the actual security reality. It was a bureaucracy running on pure ideological momentum.
So the system was that entrenched. How did it finally stop? McCarthy himself eventually fell.
McCarthy's demise was helped by a few things. The stabilization of the Cold War. Stalin died in '53, the Korean War ended shortly after, and critically, President Eisenhower's strategic action. Eisenhower realized McCarthy was a liability, and he sought to co-opt anti-communism to sideline the hard right.
He adopted the rhetoric himself.
He adopted strong anti-communist rhetoric himself while opposing McCarthy's crude individual methods. He essentially neutralized McCarthy's political brand.
But the infrastructure, that legislative skeleton of repression, it remained intact. It was ready to be deployed again.
It did. The political necessity of demonstrating your anti-communist zealotry was so ingrained that in 1954, Senate Democrats, including Hubert Humphrey, pushed through the Communist Control Act. It made CBUSA membership illegal, a measure even J. Edgar Hoover had previously opposed as too extreme.
So even after McCarthy's censure, the system of ideological conformity was still politically mandatory.
Which means the structural end had to come not from the political branches, but from an external check, the Supreme Court.
The judicial branch, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, ultimately served as the demolition crew.
That's a good way to put it. The final legal end came in 1957 with a series of landmark decisions that dismantled the legal foundation of repression. The key rulings were Yates v. United States and Watkins v. United States.
How exactly did Yates dismantle the Smith Act?
Yates introduced a crucial distinction. It ruled that the Smith Act could only target actual incitement to action, to overthrow the government, not merely the advocacy of abstract doctrine or the teaching of communist theory.
Which severely restricted the government's ability to prosecute people just for their beliefs or for being party members.
It effectively ended the mass Smith Act prosecutions.
And what about Watkins?
Watkins v. United States restricted the investigatory power of HUAC itself. It put the Red Hunters on notice by insisting that Congress had abused its investigative authority. It said HUAC had to clearly define the legislative purpose of its questioning and respect the rights of witnesses. Taken together, these decisions signaled that the judiciary was no longer going to just rubber stamp the political excesses of the anti-communist security state.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, Risen's book really helps us understand the structural way that fear operates as a governing force. What are the core lessons for us today?
I think firstly, the Red Scare shows how legitimate concerns about security, there were Soviet spies, can be systematically leveraged and weaponized to achieve a separate, decades-old political goal. The Cold War provided the external imperative and the institutional tools they needed to win the cultural war against anti-New Deal progressivism. Fear was not a spontaneous outburst. It was a highly managed political product.
And secondly, there's the immense cost of ideological conformity. It left a permanent scar on the American left in thousands of lost careers, deep internal divides between progressives and moderates, and the destruction of that militant, visionary labor vanguard that fought for social justice.
And it permanently altered the trajectory of the American right. By successfully embracing and deploying this anti-communist paranoia, the Red Scare empowered and legitimized a paranoid conspiratorial core within the conservative movement. Even when Eisenhower pushed them back to the fringe, they had tasted influence, they'd organized themselves into a potent political bloc, and they remained convinced that the entire liberal establishment was fundamentally compromised.
And finally, I think the critical lesson is about the memory of repression. The key takeaway is that democratic erosion rarely arrives through a dramatic coup. It often feels legal, procedural, even necessary.
And the repressive infrastructure, the loyalty oaths, the institutionalized lists, the detention plans, it remained in place. It demonstrates how readily these structures, once they're built, can be turned against future political enemies, whether they're civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, or simply perceived dissenters.
Which raises a crucial reflection for us as citizens. The book helps us see the absolute fragility of democratic institutions when external threats align perfectly with these long-simmering internal cultural animosities.
We have to ask, how vigilant must civil society and political leaders be to prevent the normalization of surveillance and ideological exclusion? What structural checks, beyond the occasional intervention of the Supreme Court, can ensure that political difference is not immediately and automatically conflated with national disloyalty? That enduring tension is the structural recurrence we must always guard against in any perceived emergency.
The book discussed today was Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America by Clay Rizin. We highly encourage you to read the book or borrow it from a library to gain a deeper understanding of this pivotal era and the systems it created.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.